The debate opened with an immediate shift in tone the moment Jasmine Crockett took the floor. Her presence alone signaled that the discussion would not follow the usual pattern of rehearsed talking points and predictable exchanges. The supporters of Greg Abbott's bill had framed their proposal as a necessary response to a statewide emergency, but Crockett approached that claim with deliberate calm. She began by addressing the foundation of the bill's justification, explaining that no state agency had issued any declaration that matched the alarmist rhetoric used to promote the legislation. Reports from relevant departments showed no operational overloads, no legal breakdowns, and no indicators of the crisis narrative being pushed. Through a detailed review of the available data, Crockett revealed inconsistencies that immediately forced listeners to question the validity of the bill's urgency. This direct challenge to the foundational premise of the bill set the tone for everything that followed. Crockett pointed out that when legislation is built on exaggerated circumstances, its operational design is almost always flawed. She walked through examples of previous rushed bills that had failed due to incomplete planning, unclear authority, and poorly defined enforcement mechanisms. Supporters attempted to interrupt by restating their claims about rising concerns across the state, but Crockett countered with documented timelines, showing that the alleged problems had not significantly changed in years. Her point was clear. An issue that remains stable over long periods does not qualify as a sudden emergency requiring accelerated legislative action. After dismantling the sense of urgency, she moved to the public narrative being circulated around the bill. Supporters had described it as a carefully crafted measure created in consultation with stakeholders and experts. Crockett showed that this story did not hold up under scrutiny. Advisory boards had been excluded from drafting discussions, local governments had not been invited to contribute to policy language, and agencies expected to enforce the bill were not briefed before it was presented. She displayed statements from multiple officials who confirmed they were blindsided by the proposal, demonstrating that the supporters' claims of broad consultation were more political branding than fact. The chamber's attention tightened as Crockett highlighted this contradiction. Without collaboration, she argued, a bill cannot be considered structurally sound. Laws affecting multiple layers of government require coordination, planning, feedback, and revision. Without those elements, legislative outcomes are unstable. She explained that effective governance depends on collaboration, not unilateral drafting designed to fit political narratives. The debate intensified when she began examining the structure of the bill. Crockett showed that the proposed enforcement model contained overlapping jurisdictions that would force agencies to either overstep their authority or constantly seek clarification. Vague clauses left room for broad interpretation, opening the door to inconsistent enforcement across counties. Supporters tried to claim that flexibility was intentional, but Crockett countered by tracing legal consequences from previous bills written in similarly broad language. Those policies had resulted in multi-year legal battles, contradictory local interpretations, and administrative confusion that cost millions to correct. Her explanation made it evident that the broad language was not flexibility, it was a legislative shortcut used when drafters lack operational clarity. She emphasized that enforcement agencies require specific procedures, not general statements that depend on interpretation. Court systems, reporting databases, and oversight boards cannot operate on assumptions or political rhetoric. They require precise legal definitions to avoid conflict. Once she established the structural weaknesses, Crockett transitioned to the financial dimension of the debate. She laid out cost projections showing that implementing the bill would force local governments to create new compliance units, update reporting systems, and provide training to personnel, none of which were funded by the bill. She explained that legislation shifting costs onto municipalities without providing state resources is not fiscal responsibility. It is legislative negligence disguised as reform. Cities would be forced to either raise taxes or cut essential services to absorb the burden. Supporters attempted to argue that local governments should be able to adjust, but Crockett presented years of budget data, proving that many municipalities were already operating under tight constraints caused by previous unfunded mandates. Her financial analysis struck a nerve because it reframed the bill not as a reform effort but as a cost transfer mechanism. The state would claim credit for action while local governments would pay for the consequences. By breaking down the numbers, Crockett demonstrated that the bill was not designed with economic sustainability in mind. Its financial impact was, in her words, a hidden tax disguised as enforcement policy. Crockett then addressed the legal vulnerabilities embedded in the bill. She explained that several clauses conflicted with existing constitutional standards, especially in areas involving authority, accountability, and jurisdiction. Citing relevant case law, she showed that courts had historically rejected legislation written with the same ambiguities found in this proposal. Supporters tried to brush aside the legal concerns by claiming that courts would adapt, but Crockett reminded them that courts do not rewrite legislation, they strike it down. If the bill passed in its current form, it would likely face immediate legal challenges, delaying implementation and wasting taxpayer money on litigation. Her argument made it impossible to ignore the reality that the bill had been drafted without appropriate legal vetting. The audience could see the pattern emerging: rushed timeline, weak structure, vague authority, ignored stakeholders, and unfunded requirements. As the first segment of the debate drew to a close, Crockett summarized the core problem. The bill was created quickly, branded loudly, and reviewed superficially. Its flaws were not minor, they were embedded at every level, from justification to design to funding to legality. By the time she paused, the supporters' talking points had already been severely weakened, not through emotional appeals, but through evidence, logic, and the exposure of inconsistencies. The exchange intensified when attention turned toward the financial burden the proposal would impose on the state. The narration of the debate made it clear that the critics were not objecting for the sake of obstruction, but because the numbers behind the proposal simply did not hold together. One-sided presentations from supporters highlighted projected benefits, while ignoring long-term costs, but the opposing side placed the full balance sheet on display. The analysis showed unfunded mandates hidden deep within the bill's structure, obligations that would fall not on government agencies, but directly on local communities already stretched thin. The moment this financial breakdown was presented, the tone in the chamber changed. What had once been framed as a bold initiative began to look like a calculated attempt to shift responsibility downward, while capturing political credit upward. During the retelling of the debate, the most striking element was the way the argument drifted from policy into accountability. Supporters attempted to bend the conversation toward emotional appeals, suggesting that hesitation or scrutiny was equivalent to indifference. Yet the opposing side dismantled this narrative by redirecting the conversation to evidence, reminding the chamber that moral urgency meant nothing without functional planning. A point was made that emotional appeals are often the first refuge of legislation lacking a strong factual spine. This reframing caused several supporters to retreat from their earlier confidence, forced to defend the bill's structure rather than its symbolism. Attention then moved toward the implementation strategies hidden within the proposal. The debate narrative highlighted how several provisions appeared deceptively simple until examined under operational reality. Requirements that seemed minor, such as response times, deployment protocols, or verification procedures, were exposed as unrealistic under existing infrastructure. It was pointed out that the proposal demanded performance levels that had never been achieved even in well-funded regions, yet expected overburdened departments to meet those same standards without additional resources. As the analysis unfolded, it became apparent that the bill would create more operational failures than solutions, setting agencies up for public blame while denying them the tools required to succeed. Another central moment in the debate came when the issue of authority was scrutinized. The proposal granted expanded powers to specific offices without establishing corresponding checks. The recount of the debate emphasized that this imbalance was not a minor oversight but a fundamental threat to democratic governance. When authority expands without proportional oversight, the potential for misuse rises dramatically. This argument resonated strongly in the room, particularly among lawmakers wary of concentrating too much control in any single branch or office. Supporters attempted to justify the imbalance by citing efficiency, but efficiency was dismissed as an inadequate justification for undermining structural accountability. The discussion then turned toward precedent. Critics traced the lineage of similar legislation from past sessions and demonstrated a visible pattern: temporary emergency expansions of power that quietly became permanent. This pattern was not theoretical. Documented examples were presented showing how previous expansions, promised as short-term solutions, lingered long after their supposed necessity had passed. The retelling of the debate emphasized that lawmakers had been burned before by such promises, and this historical memory weighed heavily on the room. It became difficult for supporters to convince anyone that this time would be different, especially when no sunset clauses or rollback mechanisms were included. One of the more compelling segments of the exchange centered on truthfulness. Supporters had repeatedly framed the bill as universally supported by experts. However, the opposing side produced direct statements from specialists contradicting that claim. Analysts, legal scholars, operational leaders, they had all raised concerns, and those concerns had been selectively omitted from the narrative presented to the public. When these omissions were exposed, the credibility of the bill's supporters took a significant hit. It is one thing to defend a flawed proposal, it is another to do so while withholding contradicting evidence. This revelation created a noticeable shift in the room's energy, as lawmakers began questioning not just the bill itself, but the integrity of the campaign promoting it. Another key portion of the retelling focused on how the debate revealed deeper philosophical differences. Supporters emphasized centralized control, swift executive action, and minimal deliberation. Critics emphasized transparency, collaborative planning, and constitutional consistency. The clash between these perspectives became symbolic of a broader struggle, whether policy should be built on measured governance or on reactive authority. This philosophical divide was not merely academic, it influenced how each side interpreted every clause of the proposal. As the disagreement sharpened, it became clear that the bill was not simply a matter of logistics, but a reflection of contrasting visions for the state's future. Toward the final stretch of the debate, attention turned back to the real-world impact on residents. Critics described how the proposal would disproportionately affect communities already carrying heavy civic burdens. They argued that the bill would widen disparities rather than resolve them. Supporters attempted to counter with generalized claims of improved safety and stability, but these claims lacked measurable benchmarks. Without metrics, promises were considered hollow. The narration emphasized how this discrepancy demonstrated the core weakness of the proposal. It offered sweeping promises with no mechanisms to evaluate success. The debate grew sharper when the topic of transparency reemerged. The bill contained reporting requirements that were vague, easily circumvented, or left to administrative discretion. Critics argued that this vagueness operated like a smokescreen, appearing responsible while offering no real accountability. This critique resonated strongly because lawmakers understood that vague reporting often leads to invisible failures. Without mandatory disclosures and independent review, even well-intended programs can slide into inefficiency or misuse. As the retelling approached the debate's conclusion, the overall theme became unmistakable. The bill was portrayed as a structure built on selective truths, incomplete planning, and authority without balance. Supporters tried to salvage momentum through rhetorical appeals, but the earlier dismantling of their claims left them little ground to stand on. By this point, the room had shifted decisively. Questions that once seemed supportive had turned skeptical, and those who initially backed the bill found themselves defending provisions they had not fully understood. What remained by the end of this segment was not merely disagreement but recognition. The chamber recognized that the proposal's weaknesses were not incidental, they were foundational. The debate, as retold, made clear that every layer of the bill contained unresolved contradictions, and once contradictions accumulate beyond a certain point, even the most determined supporters struggle to maintain confidence in the structure they are trying to uphold. The final phase of the debate moved into a deeper examination of consequences, both intended and unintended. The narration highlighted how the opposing side shifted from structural criticism to a broader exploration of what would actually happen if the proposal were enacted. The argument was laid out clearly: policies do not operate in theory, they operate in communities, workplaces, and institutions with limited time, budgets, and manpower. The proposal, despite its bold presentation, was shown to have ripple effects that extended far beyond the chamber. Many of those ripple effects had never been addressed by its supporters. A critical moment came when attention turned to enforcement. The proposal granted wide latitude to agencies without specifying operational guidelines. This raised a major concern. Without guidelines, enforcement could vary dramatically by region, leading to uneven application and potential abuses. The opposing side pointed out that vague authority combined with high pressure to deliver results often leads agencies to overreach, not because of malice, but because of uncertainty. When a law is unclear, implementation becomes guesswork, and guesswork is dangerous when tied to sweeping powers. Supporters attempted to dismiss these worries as speculation, but the opposing side countered with documented examples from past legislation where ambiguity produced serious real-world harm. The debate narrative emphasized how this tension exposed an uncomfortable truth. The proposal seemed to prioritize political impact over operational safety. Every time critics asked for details, staffing plans, budget outlines, oversight procedures, they were met with slogans instead of answers. The contrast between the two sides became increasingly sharp. One side sought practicality, the other leaned entirely on rhetoric. As more questions went unanswered, the proposal's foundation seemed to shrink, revealing how much of it depended on trust rather than structure. Another strong point in the debate centered on the broader constitutional environment. Critics argued that the proposal risked normalizing a pattern in which major policy decisions bypassed established review processes. Instead of moving through traditional checks, judicial analysis, agency review, budget scoring, the proposal attempted to carve out exceptions for itself. The narration pointed out that this was not a technical detail, but a deliberate shift toward executive-driven policymaking. Such a shift, if accepted, would set a precedent that future administrations could exploit, regardless of ideology. Supporters tried to frame this as necessary efficiency, but the opposing side dismantled that argument by explaining that efficiency without safeguards often paves the way for unchecked authority. One of the most revealing sections of the debate involved the voices of communities who would be directly affected. Testimonies and analyses had been submitted, but supporters glossed over them, treating them as minor objections rather than substantive warnings. Critics revisited these testimonies in detail, showing how the proposal overlooked the lived realities of the very people it claimed to protect. In several cases, the bill would create administrative backlogs that would slow down essential services. In other cases, it would force local governments to reallocate funds from critical programs just to comply. These examples were not hypothetical. They were drawn from municipal reports, expert evaluations, and previous legislative outcomes. The retelling made it clear that the proposal's authors had not engaged meaningfully with the communities affected, relying instead on assumptions that crumbled under scrutiny. The chamber shifted further when the discussion turned toward political consistency. Critics noted that several supporters had previously argued against similar expansions of authority when proposed by other administrations. This inconsistency was highlighted to show that the issue was not ideology but power. When one's own side holds authority, expansions of power feel justified. When the opposing side holds authority, they become dangerous. The debate exposed this contradiction, forcing several supporters to confront the uncomfortable reality that their position was rooted not in principle, but in convenience. This revelation weakened their credibility, making their remaining arguments appear increasingly hollow. The narration then showed how the debate moved into a realm that supporters had hoped to avoid: unintended incentives. The proposal's structure created opportunities for misallocation, rushed decisions, and even manipulation of performance data. Agencies under pressure to meet unrealistic expectations might prioritize quantity over quality or optics over accuracy. Critics demonstrated how these incentives had manifested in similar programs, where rushed implementation led to public confusion, bureaucratic strain, and systemic inefficiencies that took years to unwind. The idea that this proposal could suffer the same fate made several lawmakers hesitant, even those initially inclined to support it. When the debate turned to long-term stability, the opposition's argument reached its peak. They explained that good policy survives leadership changes, economic fluctuations, and shifting public sentiment. This proposal, however, was so reliant on short-term political energy that it lacked the structural durability needed to function over time. Without stable funding, clear lines of authority, or detailed contingency planning, it risked collapsing under its own weight. The narration emphasized that a policy built on temporary resolve is destined to fail when the political moment passes. The final rounds of the debate revealed that supporters were running out of substantive ground. Their arguments became repetitive, relying on broad claims of necessity rather than addressing the specific contradictions raised. Meanwhile, critics continued presenting data, historical comparisons, legal analysis, and community perspectives. The contrast between evidence and rhetoric became undeniable. The opposition was not operating from emotion or partisanship, it was operating from logic, structure, and precedent. As this became clearer, the tone of the room changed from confrontation to recognition. In the closing minutes, the debate crystallized around a single overarching theme: responsibility. Critics argued that lawmakers had a responsibility not to pass flawed legislation just because it was politically advantageous. They stressed that legislation must be built to withstand scrutiny, interpretation, and decades of real-to-world application. The proposal, as dissected throughout the debate, did not meet that threshold. It relied on assumptions instead of research, on authority instead of accountability, and on immediate optics instead of long-term stability. The narration made clear that lawmakers understood this by the end, even those who had initially championed the proposal with confidence. By the final moments, the momentum had shifted entirely. Questions that were once supportive had turned skeptical. Endorsements that once seemed certain had begun to waver. The debate's retelling showed that the proposal had not simply been challenged. It had been taken apart piece by piece until its core weaknesses were impossible to ignore. What remained was a recognition that passing the bill in its current form would not strengthen the state but burden it. The outcome was not yet decided, but the debate had made one truth unmistakable. The proposal, once presented as decisive and unstoppable, now stood on fractured ground, its justifications shattered by scrutiny, evidence, and unrelenting questioning.